Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. In our ongoing series about AI, to discuss the AI Governance Guidelines Development Report released by Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, today we are joined by Ms. Angelina. Angelina is the Program Director of the Future Foresight Initiative at Transitions Research, and her work focuses on the intersection of AI, society, and anticipatory governance of technologies. Some of her work on AI and other techno-social infrastructure has appeared in contributions to Indian Sociology, Economic and Political Weekly, and The Print. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talks, Angelina.
To be here.
Could you provide an overview of the AI Governance Guideline Development Report released by Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology?
Sure. So I think the way to look at this report is essentially as a step in the direction of what they're calling an India-centric approach to AI governance. And essentially how this report has come about is that under the chairmanship and the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to India, a multi-stakeholder advisory group had been set up to create AI governance, provide guidance on AI governance. And within that, a subcommittee was created to delve into this question of what AI governance guidelines look like. So this report that we have in front of us is the result of the mandate of this subcommittee that has now been released for public consultation by MeitY. And in terms of what the report itself contains, there's significant several segments that are crucial in this report. So one segment that's quite important is the segment on principles that gives you a sense of what sort of principles should guide AI governance going forward, as well as there is a section on gap analysis where they essentially examine the question of whether, when it comes to things like deepfakes or copyright issues, whether current laws and the regulatory frameworks that we have in place are sufficient, or do we need to explore new laws or amend laws in this arena. And the report also has a section on recommendations that has, again, various recommendations aligned towards AI governance. One of them being setting up a technical secretariat in order to coordinate efforts and identify AI risks and harms. The way I look at this report is essentially as a framing document. I think it gives us a good amount of insight into what the contours of AI governance and what the character of these conversations could look like, how the future of AI governance in India is going to shape up. And it gives you also a good sense of the kind of values and priorities that are being upheld and taken forward in the thinking on AI governance.
So the ministry has previously released several reports, one of them being Responsible AI for All, Adopting the Framework. How does this new report fit within the broader context of AI regulation as envisioned by the government? Does it introduce any significant differences, or is it largely aligned with their past efforts?
So from the beginning, India's foray into the question of AI governance and into this whole conversation, starting with the 2018 NITI Aayog strategy paper, of India's AI strategy paper, I think the overall emphasis has been in India kind of striking a balance between two sorts of imperatives. On one hand, the imperative to bolster innovation and to essentially use technology, AI in this context as a lever for socioeconomic growth and development. At the same time, keeping an eye towards inclusive growth and making sure that the benefits of these technologies are distributed equitably, as well as mitigating the harms and the potential risks that can come with these technologies. So I think that kind of a dual imperative between enhancing innovation and socioeconomic development while making sure that there are certain guardrails in place, or there is at least there are ways in which we can mitigate AI harms, has been sort of prevalent in the thinking so far, and we kind of continue to see that pan out. Of course, striking this balance is not always easy, and then we have seen in the past in this kind of evolving trajectory of AI governance, kind of seen a bit of sort of a toggle between a more direct and interventionist approach, but at the same time taking a more hands-off kind of an approach. So I think what we're seeing in the AI governance space, also with this move in general with the India AI mission, is much more emphasis now being placed on actually enhancing capacity to leverage AI, enhancing compute capacity, working on data infrastructures, data availability, and also like just making sure that the data that is available is clean. So we're seeing a lot of industrial policy, like industrial policies in this space, focusing on startups and skill building. And from this report, what one can kind of glean from it is also that there is an optimistic yet cautious approach, where we do understand that there are certain harms and risks that can come within the context of AI. So I think to answer your question in terms of whether there have been, whether it's along similar lines or whether it is something that is we're seeing something new, I think the balancing of innovation with mitigation of harms or with inclusive growth, I think has been an enduring sort of a lens through which AI has been viewed. But at the same time, I think what this report also points towards is perhaps kind of the expansion of the thinking in some ways, where issues like principles like sustainability and questions of the environmental impact of AI do feature into this report, which a couple of years back did not find much of a mention in many of these sorts of documents.
The report also proposes several AI governance principles, some of them being transparency, accountability, and safety. How do you view these principles? And in your opinion, are they sufficient for effective AI governance?
Right. So at on the question of principles, I think at a very basic level, it's heartening to see the expansion of the scope of principles with references to, like I was mentioning, sustainability and sustainable development goals. However, having said that, I think there are certain tensions and complexities within the whole issue of principles that kind of are left unaddressed. So if you actually look at the principles section, you will see that it comes with a slight bit of explanation. However, that explanation is a little thin. And more importantly, I think within the AI ethics and AI research, AI society research, a lot of work has already been conducted in examining the role of principles and what principles enable or do not enable us to do. And, so there's a lot of work that examines the sort of broader discourse of AI principles and the work that they do. And from there, we know that, there are like several shortcomings that, or at least several complexities that are rooted in the question of principles. Often principles have certain normative assumptions and one-sided assumptions or text-centric assumptions that are baked into it. So for example, the principle of fairness is included in this list of principles in the report. And fairness is something that we know is also highly contextual. It depends, it varies from culture to culture, group to group, right? So for instance, you have notions of individual fairness vis-a-vis notions of group fairness. So something that is fair for the group may not be fair for an individual. At the same time, for a lot of marginalized groups or historically marginalized groups, the idea of fairness has a certain emancipatory lens to it. And fairness is much more about addressing historical inequities, whereas maybe institutionally, sometimes the idea of fairness becomes that of procedural fairness, fairness of the means and methods that are being applied. So essentially, my point is that a lot of these principles are already very contested, and there are also critiques of the sort of how principles can sometimes also be co-opted. And so while principles are maybe a good foundation or a good place to begin with, the question, the actual question is how do you operationalize and how do you kind of actualize these principles in practice? And it may not always be easy to do merely at an artifact or at an algorithm or model level, right? I think a lot of the emphasis on principles sometimes tends to sit on the models and sort of addressing or wiring principles into how AI systems get developed and sort of into the tech itself. However, what we know is that these principles and the outcomes are much more play out in much more systemic sense.
The report also puts a lot of emphasis on a techno-legal approach to AI governance. How feasible is this approach, and what challenges might arise in its implementation?
Right. So as I was saying, right, the techno-legal approach is part of that whole idea and question of how do you operationalize principles. So essentially what the paper is providing is it gives us three sort of pathways, and I think they all interconnect, but three sort of pathways into operationalizing the various principles that have been laid out in the paper. So one of the pathways is, for instance, the life cycle approach, right, where you examine the entire gamut, the entire kind of life cycle of AI development and deployment diffusion. And then the second pathway is kind of taking an ecosystem view of AI and looking at the different stakeholders and the diversity of stakeholders that exist within that system. And the third pathway is that AI governance needs the approach that they are taking, and it's kind of moving away from the command and control approach. So the third approach or pathway that they take is one which is geared to what they're calling a techno-legal approach. Now, a couple of observations and thoughts on each of these approaches, and I'll also address your question on the techno-legal approach. So when it comes to examining the life cycle of AI, here in this paper, the life cycle essentially starts at the process, at the step of development. However, if you look at the OECD life cycle that they have kind of put out in their report on the environmental impact of AI, or if you look at any other work that kind of looks into the question of the social materiality and the environmental impact of AI, then you understand that the life cycle actually begins far more upstream, right? It begins at the level of resource extraction and maybe even prior to that. So in that sense, I think the life cycle approach, while it's great on paper, and I think in terms of the lens to understanding the AI ecosystem and understanding the different points in which interventions can be made is important, but I think we need to expand and kind of take into consideration the entirety of the life cycle and not kind of restrict ourselves to just the three phases, right? Similarly, when we look at the ecosystem approach, the paper mentions several stakeholders, including data principals and till end users, developers, deployers are also in the mix. However, and I think this addition of the end user is important, and it's useful. And I think it's also come about in the larger context of generative AI and large language models, because there's been a lot of focus on the end user and the kind of interactions that people are having with these sort of AI systems and chatbots. And while the end user is an important stakeholder in this process, I do think that we need to kind of make a distinction between the end user and the affected user, because in many cases, if you look at predictive AI systems, for instance, the end user and the affected user is not always the same. So for instance, if a radiologist is looking at a scan and coming up with a diagnosis, the affected user is someone else, right? And the end user is the radiologist. Several other examples, I think it applies to the use of AI in judicial system also, in terms of looking at parole sentences and things like that. So the affected user is an important stakeholder. And if we are taking an ecosystem approach, then we need to kind of, again, take stock of a much wider set of actors. And the good thing about the affected user lens is because I think it applies both upstream and downstream. So affected users or affected persons, let's say, or entities could even be people that are affected by the impacts of data centers in their regions, or people who are impacted by mining and resource extraction and so on and so forth. So I think if we take both an upstream and downstream view of it, then we will find that the number of stakeholders is perhaps larger in this context. Now, coming to the techno-legal approach, I think within the techno-legal approach is one way to move away from that command and control sort of an approach where it's far more top-down and hierarchical in terms of what sort of governance frameworks and structures will exist in the context of AI. However, I think there are other bottom-up approaches that one can also look into and consider. And between the technological and the legal, right? We know that legal approaches or regulation tends to lag behind innovation, not just in the context of AI, in the case of many emerging technologies. And so when we're saying techno-legal, it's also technical first, because those are, in some senses, they can move faster than legal approaches can. So that's one. And the other thing is that the minute we kind of frame and interpret questions of ethics and questions of principles in this kind of a technical lens and technical framework, and we try to kind of, almost ring fence that within that imagination, the one worry or concern is, it becomes difficult for a lot of people to understand and how it operates, right? And because of that, it could, how the question then becomes, how do you sort of make room for social participation and a more deliberative processes? So that's definitely, I think, one challenge that comes with a techno-legal approach.
What are your thoughts on the proposed establishment of a technical secretariat and its responsibilities?
So the technical secretariat is one of the core recommendations of this report. And on one level, I think that the technical secretariat can be really useful, because if you look at the mandate of what has been set up for the technical secretariat is pulling together diverse multidisciplinary expertise coming from various different domains, including law, technical expertise, economics, right? And then some of the activities that the technical secretariat is expected to do is sort of do a stakeholder mapping, understanding the ecosystem better, horizon scanning to kind of understand what are the emerging trends or what are the emerging sort of plausible and possible futures that can have a widespread impact in this domain, right? And also kind of working with industry to encourage self-regulation. So I think a lot of that work is already being done in many aspects. For instance, in transitions research, we do a lot of work on horizon scanning and within the Future Foresight initiative, trying to understand what the different plausible and possible futures are. And that's good to see in terms of policy making moving more in that direction of anticipating and anticipating potential futures or anticipating potential harms and risks, and at the same time, bringing that kind of foresight lens to how we think about governance and how we think about policy. However, I think the question, there are two levels of questions here within the technical secretariat. I think one is the who of it, right? Who are the people that will be part of this secretariat? Who, like I said, because there's a lot of work already ongoing, it'll be nice to see a more diverse and multi-stakeholder engagement take shape in the form of the technical secretariat, and it'll be good to see then kind of not starting from scratch, but using the work that has already been done on this space or is being conducted by several organizations and academia, within academia and research institutions. The other thing within the technical secretariat, I think one of the things that is being proposed very concretely is to set up some sort of an AI incidents database, which is similar to the OECD AI incidents database there. And so I think in that context, what I must emphasize is that, there are various levels of AI incidents, right? It could be something in like a self-driving car or an autonomous vehicular crash, which is easy to see, pinpoint, but incidents could also take the shape of harder to identify, deep-rooted institutional challenges, for example, issues of bias that may not necessarily be immediately apparent, and that requires a lot of research and understanding on the ground. And that also requires transparency and access to understanding how a lot of these applications work. So I think a lot of things have to come together in order to actually be able to understand the AI harms or the potential risks that are taking shape. So it will be good to see in terms of how it pans out moving forward and how this work progresses.
In your opinion, what are some key gaps or omissions in the report that should have been addressed, and what would be your recommendations for the same?
So I think in terms of the key gaps or omissions, I think some of them have already emerged in the course of our conversation, right? So like I was saying, that we can do a better job of expanding our understanding of the ecosystem and expanding the life cycle and understanding it in a much more holistic way, right? And to also think about the entire gamut of AI technologies, and not just kind of think through generative AI as almost a representative case, because that can kind of leave out a few important factors, like I was mentioning with the affected users, for instance. So those are gaps, but I think, and that can be easily addressed moving forward. I think in terms of a much more broader perspective, what I see in this report, and often when we talk about AI, in general terms, I think we often tend to frame AI in a much more instrumental point of view. So we look at it as a technology and as a lever for innovation and economic growth and development. Ultimately, we look at it as a tool, right, as a means to achieve an end. But I think AI is much more than merely a technology or a technical artifact that operates in isolation. So the way we think about AI is more from the lens of a socio-technological system, where there's an ensemble of elements, people, institutions, culture, materiality that comes into the formation of AI for what it is. So, and that sort of a perspective gives you a much more complex and holistic understanding of this phenomena in front of us, right? And this is not to say that AI is not a tool, right? There are applications within, there are several AI applications that can be used for very specific purposes and that can be used very beneficially for people. But when we're talking about, when we're taking a wide sort of a bird's eye view of it, and when we're talking about governance, then we kind of need to be also a little bit more mindful about how we're framing the character and scope of this technology, because then that kind of makes sure that we don't sort of miss out on harms that can be that can come much, much later, or other ecosystem harms that we have not considered, right? So if we kind of stick to an instrumental view of technology, then we are much more likely to kind of concentrate only on those harms that we see materialize as a result of model output or as a result of a design flaw. And I think the conversation on governance can be much more broader than that.
Thank you so much, Angelina, for joining us today and providing us an overview of the report and highlighting some of the critical gaps and what is good in this report. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.